Hello, everyone.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about something that I didn't realize that Coda does during our discipline sessions that actually is kind of a key part of what makes them successful.
But before we get to that, we want to ask you to hit that like button. It lets us know what content you're enjoying. And of course, hit the subscribe button because every time you hit the subscribe button, it makes me smile.
If you want to get bonus content, dive deeper into the topic of domestic discipline, the best place to do that is over on Patreon. A link to our Patreon is down below.
So, yeah, this was a conversation that we had that we decided that we would share with everyone.
That's right, because I was recently talking to some people and the subject of this came up and I brought it to you and I was like, have you ever thought about this? I know that it happens, but was that a decision you
Like a
made or
conscious
yeah.
thing, yeah.
And you said, well, yeah, it is. And so I thought, okay, let's talk about it. And what that is that it's this point in the spanking where you can tell that I have yielded to the process, that I have kind of been broken down, if you will, like those walls of resistance have been broken down. I am submitting to the process of the spanking, and I have reached that point of submission within the discipline process. And that's what we're going to be talking about today because I did not realize that this was something that you did on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At what point did you decide that that was something that you were going to make sure happened during discipline?
I think as we have slowly kind of redefined our discipline system over time, where that first kind of occurred to me was when we were having a lot of issues involving discipline. And what I mean is that we would do discipline, but you had made comments about, I just don't feel like I'm reset, or can't remember the exact words that you used, but it just definitely, the demeanor that I got from you and sometimes just your own feedback made me go, oh, I think I really need to start paying attention to where I see her demeanor and see her emotions throughout the punishment to gauge what's going on with her to figure out, have we done enough yet? And part of that, um, I was able to get by us just refining the process. So it wasn't totally me going, okay, I'm going to uh, figure out where she's at, and then I'm going to push it necessarily beyond that. But it was as we refined the system, my findings kind of came along for the ride, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Now, as I was talking through this with some other people, the concept of getting to that point of submission, that point of like all the resistance is gone, the at that point, that's when the spanking actually really starts.
Yes.
Is that something that you have adapted, and how do you conduct the spanking to make sure that you have enough of that discipline aspect after that resistance is gone?
I think, well, now that we've refined our discipline system to be very effective, um, I don't have to think about it as much because I already know that when we get to a certain place in our current discipline system, that everything that follows after it is going to be exactly what I need. But when we first started refining it, the first thing that I did is, you can really tell with your taken in hand when they've kind of broken through that point. And at least with you, and it'll be different, I think, with every taken in hand. You have to really get to know their personality well. But with you, it was when the tears really started to flow a lot, when you were starting to really apologize a lot,
Mm-hmm.
when you were starting to say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Those were the kind of the cues for me to go, okay, now we have gotten to the point where the punishment can start, because there are certain things that you're not able to receive until you get to that point.
Is that why you don't have a problem with me like apologizing mid spanking? because it actually gives you feedback?
Yes, because, and I need that feedback in order to go, now comes the point where she has been broken down to that point, if you will. We've gotten through all of the different levels that we need to get to get to the point where now what the spanking will do is by you apologizing, by you saying you're sorry, now it's effective to understand why you're getting it and why you don't want to do this again. The lesson begins, in other words.
That's interesting because that's a very personality driven thing. I know that, there's some head of households that they don't want that verbal feedback during a spanking. There's some taken in hands that don't give verbal feedback during a spanking. And so, but that is something that I have always just instinctively done. And you always said that you didn't mind, but I didn't realize that it was actually giving you feedback.
Yeah, and again, those I didn't know until you had just brought it up that there are some head of households that don't necessarily like that feedback, and there's some taken in hands that don't give that. And so I think it's important to mention before we go on that that is okay. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong. But what you have to do, like in our situation, is you have to figure out by either conversation or as you go along, you refine your discipline system, you figure out what those cues are. And yes, for you, that cue happens to be when you start apologizing a lot. And again, I feel more tears from you. And this is going to sound a little strange, but you can just kind of feel a difference in the room happen all of a sudden. It's like this tension goes to release all of a sudden. And that's when I really know that, okay, again, it's time. Now the punishment really has begun. Even though we've already started, this is where the real change happens.
This is when I'm actually receiving discipline, not just bearing the discipline.
Oh, that's good. I like that. I like what you just said. I think that's a great way to say it.
And yeah, every taken in hand is going to have different cues to when that is. And so that's part of what you were saying. You just need to figure out your taken in hand and learn what those cues are, what that process is for you. Because it's going to look different.
As you refine your discipline system, this point is really important to find. That's kind of why what are the things that you need to find or to know in order to continue or to figure out, okay, now the punishment can continue, in other words.
I feel like where we are at in our discipline now, it's a pretty predictable point of when that's going to happen for me. But what if I'm having a hard day? What if I'm just having a hard time? What if I am just putting up resistance and I don't get to that point of yielding till 4, 6, 7, 8 minutes in? Does that change how you conduct the spanking? Would you go longer in order to make sure that I still have that lesson learned time?
So, I mean, the good thing is that we've found, obviously, about our current discipline system is that hasn't happened yet.
It has not.
However, one of the things that we have talked about and that we put into place is basically what I would do is I would tack on basically our correction system. It would almost be like, okay, we're going to do the punishment. Now we're going to tack on what we do for a correction onto that because it took you so long to get to that breaking point, for a lack of a better term, in order to now receive the punishment, receive the lesson.
Because this hasn't happened, I'm going to ask a lot of questions with this one.
That's good.
So let's say that it takes me 8 minutes. That means that I only have 2 minutes of actual spanking left to receive the lesson. Our correction system is only 3 minutes. So is that something that you, if it took me that long, are you tacking on a correction or are you tacking on more of our, just what we would consider maintenance and go through a full maintenance?
That's a good question. I think if it was that long, yeah, I'd probably tack on the maintenance rather than the correction, versus if it only took you, say, 4 to 5 minutes, which, is still longer than normal, but not as long as 8 minutes, then I would just tack on the correction. So I think it would just depend on, how it went along in the punishment, and I would have to very, very quickly, and that's the key to head of households, is that you don't have a lot of time to make this decision, and you need to make it quickly, and here's why. Just as a little side caveat, because you don't want to take too long to do that, because she is in that process and you don't want to interrupt that process. That process to continue to flow is important. So if you're going to tack on, say, a maintenance or a correction, depending on how long it takes her, you need to make that decision quickly so that you can communicate, hey, it took you too long this time to get to this point. I'm tacking on this.
Do you think that it's important to say that as the spanking is happening? Like, let's say that, because this was my other follow-up question to that, is after the punishment time is done, do you let me get up and you assess and then we go back to it? Or do you tell me stay? Like, because of the progression of the implements, I kind of know when the process is supposed to be done. I
Done.
don't get up until you tell me. But do you, instead of telling me you can get up, do you say stay there and you just reset our timer?
I think that in our situation, obviously this is talking about you and I, but again, this is going to be maybe different for some of you. Knowing the way Arya's mind works and the feedback that she needs, that's a moment that I would probably give you a moment to get some water and a tissue, and then I would say we are going to continue.
We've never been through this in our current discipline system, um, which is why I'm asking all these
Yeah.
questions, because I'm like, I need to know what to expect here. But I do think it's important that you just say something like, we're going to continue.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if it's important to let me know what that's going to look like.
Oh no, I probably wouldn't tell you if it's going to be the correction or the maintenance. I'd probably
Mhm.
just say, again, here's get some water, here's a tissue, we're going to continue.
Because how long, like, are you really trying to hit like a good 5, 8, 10 minutes of like lesson learned, like spanking?
Yeah, where I gauge it is anywhere between like 7 to 10 minutes. I
Okay.
feel like that's a good range of being able for you to receive the lesson in that. And so it for yeah, 7 to 10, and the reason I say 7 to 10 is because that's a good gauge. I don't know if it's a set number, but it's a set range, and that's a really, really good range. Anything less than 7, I feel like, no, not really. That you need more.
And I think that it's important to note that that range is going to look very different for everyone.
Hmm.
Um, and you would never cut a spanking short just because I got to that point of yielding faster.
Correct. If anything, that's what I love about our current discipline system is that one of the reasons we haven't gotten here yet is because, and I think this is when I don't want to say perfected it, but you have an excellent discipline system. Is number one, we haven't necessarily gotten to this point yet, and number two, yeah, I'm not going to cut it short because we have the perfect length of punishment time. So even if you yield very, very quickly, like within the first minute, it's like, no, we're going to carry this thing out. Because, in my opinion, the more time you're taking in hand has to think about that. If they yield quick and they think about it and they have to deal with the intensity as they're thinking of the punishment. And correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I think it really deters you from wanting to do whatever the violation was again.
It does. Absolutely. That time to really let the lesson sink in and really receive discipline, um, that's like such a valuable thing. And more of that is never going to be worse. It's always going to be better.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really does do a good job, because there have been times where I am completely yielded as I'm getting in position. You haven't even started the spanking yet. Um, I don't think that that happens as often as it maybe should, but it has happened.
It has.
And so, yeah, that's why is it important to get to that point of yielding and spank beyond it?
That's a very good question. And and this also kind of goes hand in hand why you don't want to cut it short either. The reason is that there's two things going on that I realized, and this took us a while in our dynamic for me to realize this was what goes on in the taken in hand's mind. Is if you haven't yielded yet, all that's happening in the punishment is, to a certain extent, not totally, you still maybe feel a little justified in what you did, and you're not at that point of remorse yet. Like, you've yielded to, yes, okay, I'm going to have a punishment, and the punishment has now started, but you're not at the point of remorse. You're not at the point of truly feeling sorry and understanding, oh no, this is why this was bad. This is why he didn't want me to do X. And so you don't want to stop at that point. And if you stop at that point, or you don't go, if you just go slightly beyond it, you don't then have time for the second part of the process, which is, yes, I am remorseful. Oh my gosh, why did I do that? This is why he didn't want me to do this. And you need that time to go through all of those little tiny thoughts in your mind as you're receiving the punishment, so you can go through that process to get to the last part, which is, boy, this is awful. What I'm going through, I don't ever want to do this again, because I don't want to go through this. And that's why you've got to go so far beyond, and you've got to have the process be a certain length so that your taken in hand goes through all of those things. You've got to go through that mind map, if you will, to get to that final result.
I think for me, the difference and the shift really happens because yes, I have conceded that I have earned a punishment. I have put myself in position. I'm submitting to the punishment, but I'm not submitting to you yet.
Oh yeah, that's
and
good.
I submit to the punishment because I acknowledge that I broke a rule. And the consequence for breaking a rule is punishment. It's not until that mindset shift changes from I broke a rule to I acted outside of your authority. It becomes like the difference between, oh, I broke this rule and now I have to face the consequence, to I acted outside of the authority of my head of household. I violated his authority over me, and now I'm submitting myself under my head of household, and I'm going through this because I violated him.
That's
good. And that's the thought process that goes. And yes, all of the things that you said are part of it, but it's really that, like, oh, I broke a rule, I need to go through the punishment, and as the punishment goes along, I'm like, I need to submit myself to my head of household. I violated his authority, and I need to realize my position and my responsibility to follow the rules, to be obedient, to be respectful, all of those things, because that is a violation directly against my head of household. And it doesn't matter what the actual misbehavior or mistake was. It all comes down to acting outside of his authority. And then, yes, getting to that point of like, I never want to go through this again, because this is really like something that I don't want to experience.
No, I appreciate you saying all that, because then it even gets me more of a perspective of, wow, here is the details of what you're going through as we go through in a punishment.
And I think the lecture really does play a part in my ability to submit and yield myself to discipline, because it's not just you broke this rule and now you're going to be punished. It's more helpful for me when I hear you say, you broke this rule, you disobeyed me. And just using those terms, like really personalizing it and making me internalize how it was an action against you, helps me yield.
And I think you brought up a really good point. That's one reason why we've talked about, you can find past podcasts about this, where we talk about our discipline system and why you go from the lecture into the discipline, why you set up the discipline, the way that you do with the different implements is the whole reason why we encourage different implements, although you don't have to. But for us, that seems to be those different implements in the way that we have set that process up helps you go through this process that you just talked about.
Yeah, because the way we have structured it is that the implements get increasingly more severe
Right.
as the punishment goes along. And so, and switching implements does help make it to where I can't like adjust to the sensation. So it creates a very severe punishment that stays at a high level of severity because the implements progressively get more intense.
And that was a lot of conversation. That was a lot of observing what worked and what didn't. And really, again, sitting down and saying, what do we need to tweak with our punishment system? We had a lot of discussions early on where I thought you yielded, and you're like, no, not even close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did take you a while to be able to start being more perceptive of how I was responding. And that did require conversations because of who you are and how you gain information. I feel like this is something that you'll have to play into your strengths because there's some
Right.
head of households that are just a lot more perceptive and observant, and they
Mm-hmm.
might not need those actual conversations. But if you um, are confused or need to, I definitely think you should check in and just say, this is what I saw happen. Is that what you experienced?
Yeah.
And until you have those conversations, you don't know if your perceptions are correct or incorrect. And so it's good to go through that process of checking in, seeing how your taken in hand actually responded and received the discipline according to how you think they did. Um, and that's definitely like part of the process.
Yeah, and so if you find yourself struggling in this area ahead of households, where you're like, boy, I can't figure out if she's gotten to that point or not, or where we are in the process, this may be the conversation that you need to have.
And you definitely need to have that conversation if you are finding that she's just misbehaving time after time after time. Because even if you are spanking very effectively and you're going through this process and you're like, I am doing the thing, but my taken in hand is just she misbehaves, gets punished. I think it's terrible. She acts like it's terrible. I think she's yielded. And then it's not even a day or two later, and she's already done another major violation within the relationship. That is a sign that she is not actually yielding during that discipline process, even if it is sufficient in the way you're delivering it. You just maybe need to go longer or find a way that she will be able to yield and submit to it. And make sure that you are getting enough of that time after that kind of breaking point of going beyond that point for a long enough time that she's learning the lesson.
And so one of the things too, head of households, and I can hear it right now as we're recording this, you all going, well, what if I go too far? That was a fear of mine when we first started this, but I'm going to promise you, you're not going to go too far. I know it seems like, oh, geez, what if I go too far? You won't. That's the only thing I can assure you with, is that I promise you, you won't. You know one another well enough, and I promise you, you already have enough knowledge of this that if you just put yourself out there and you swallow the fear and say, okay, we're going to go, we're going to trust intuition, and we're going to have conversations, and we're going to tweak, and we're going to do all these things. But in the moment, I'm going to trust my natural instincts on this. I promise you, you're not going to go too far. That was my biggest worry. And when I finally just yielded and said, you know what, I'm just going to trust what I believe I know is right and what I know about my wife and what I can just sense from her, I never went too far. I think you would probably agree with that. And it benefited us long term.
Yes. Now, would you say that severity is a key component of being able to get to this point and having that lesson learned time?
Um, the short answer is yes. Now maybe more of the long answer. Yes, which is why we use the implements that we use. And as you said earlier, it steps up in the intensity, if you will, because the severity has to be there. Again, and why? Because that's what gets her to the breaking point, and that's what helps her go through the process of what I would call the remorse process and the logical process of having the logical mind reason through why she's getting the punishment and why she doesn't want to do this again. And if the intensity or the severity, whatever word you want to use, doesn't get worse and doesn't help her in that process, she'll never go through that. And in fact, you can probably speak to that. You'll never get to that point. You'll never be able to go through all of those steps.
I agree. And actually, one thing that was really helpful in this process for me, the thing that kind of started to transform the way I responded to discipline, was when we got rid of the warm up.
Yes. Oh yeah. I forgot about the good old warm up.
When we were using warm up, it was giving me too much time to adjust to the
Mhm.
sensation of the spanking. So by the time you got to the intensity of punishment,
Mm.
it was like I was already kind of like primed or adjusted to the sensation, and I didn't have to yield myself to it. I didn't have to kind of, it didn't break me down, break that resistance, because I kind of built up a resistance
To it.
to it. And so when we took away that warm up, that was a game changer. And then when we started using the implements that we use now, that was
Mm.
the next kind of progression in this process to where we are now, where it is very effective.
One of the things that you don't mean to do as a head of household when you first start is look at this as just something that you already naturally know and do. And what I mean by that is that when you first start domestic discipline, or at least for me, it was okay, you spank and you know, bad, don't do that again, and you move on. You don't understand that it's much more than that. It is very much, obviously, we've talked about this at length about setting boundaries and setting up your household and your relationship for the things that matter to you, being the pillars, all of those different things. And so it is important to then, in the process, think of this as just being as just as detailed and just as needed for your relationship as all of those other things. And so you need to put time and care into the discipline system and really pay attention, just as you did with the other steps. Pay attention to what your taken in hand needs in order, again, to submit. She used that word, which I thought was a great word, to resubmit themselves to you, to feel remorseful, and to understand why it is what they did was wrong, and their need to say, I don't want to do that again. And again, that is part of you, just as a head of household, being willing to say, I'm going to pay attention. And I know that sounds almost trivial, almost like, oh, really? That's what I have to tell myself? Yeah, because you may not be doing it. I didn't realize that I wasn't actually doing that. I had to consciously tell myself, I really need to pay attention to this. I really need to make sure that as we're going along, I'm just not going through the motions, that I'm really paying attention to the steps that my taken in hand is going to make sure that she gets to where she needs to be. And so that's why the punishment it's not just going through the motions. You need to be present, and you need to have your mind clear, and you need to really be paying attention to what's going on. And I think that would be the last thoughts, is be present in that process.
And make sure that you are going long enough that she is having that like extended time of being
Yes,
able to really internalize the lesson behind the discipline so that it becomes more effective.
absolutely.
Because if you don't give her that time, if you don't let that thought process happen, if you don't let the lesson be driven home at like well beyond that point of yielding, then you're discipline's just going to be much more ineffective than it could be.
And if you're finding that you're starting to really pay attention to this, but you're still having a hard time reading, that is where I was able to be more effective in that, is having the conversations with Arya and asking her questions like, I thought you were there, why weren't you? And then paying attention. It's just a matter of you're getting to still know you're taken in hand on a deeper level. That's what it is, even more of a deeper level. And eventually, all I can tell you is after you have those conversations and after you go through, you have the experience more and more and more, you'll just sync up. And we have that point now to where the reason our system works is not only because we've cultivated it, but also we are in sync in that process.
And that brings me to my kind of final thoughts is taken in hands. You have to be honest and very
Mm.
introspective. And I think I'll actually make that the subject of the bonus content this week for either patrons or YouTube members. You'll get a video on kind of being able to communicate in almost a self-sabotaging way because
Mm.
it is going to make your punishments more severe. It is going to kind of maybe create some additional rules or expectations on you. But if that's what you really need, then you have to communicate that. You have to be honest because that's where you have a responsibility to for communication to be able to drive your relationship forward in a positive way. Obviously, our head of households make the decisions, but we have to give them that information so that they can make decisions, adjust what they're doing in order to make sure that we are getting what we need out of the relationship. Because when we get the discipline we need, when we get the support that we need, it in turn gives our head of households what they need out of the relationship too. And that's where this really does become a cycle between a head of household and a taken in hand, where you are getting what you need, you're giving your head of household what they need, they're getting what they need, and then they're giving you what you need. And it's this like beautiful cycle
Yeah,
of a relationship.
I think you summed it up nicely.
So
So,
thank you guys so much for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. Again, if you want to get that bonus episode, check out the links in the description, and we will talk to you next time.
see you later.